said. And then Einstein built on Newton. But Newton was wrong. It isn't gravity, it's electricity. Anybody that wants to check that out, just go to look up the electric universe theory, and you'll find out there's a whole other alternative theory out there that makes so much more sense than gravity does, but science will not accept it because they don't want to give up Newton and they don't want to give up Einstein.
That's right, and what we need to do is learn from our mistakes, because, as you say, the mistakes, I think, are important to make, and they are that's the initiatory step, if you will, to get in the right direction. But we need to learn from our mistakes. Right now, we're kind of have this idea that we're on top of the world, we know what's going on, and people are too proud to admit that they've been wrong, and I think that ultimately will be the big kind of downfall, if you will, of much of the academic world. And I hope to some regard that we can highlight this information and bring it out there so people for themselves can look at it and look at the evidence and say, my God, there's something totally wrong here and something totally missing in the theories that they're laying at us at this moment.
Well, I think science makes the mistake of thinking, kind of what you said, that there's going to be some kind of downfall when they're proved wrong. But there never is. They're proved wrong on a very regular basis, and there's no downfall. Everybody just adjusts and they move forward. For example, one of the things I talk about in Everything You Know Is Wrong, classic example, in 1915, and this is classic because this is the way it is. Big change never, ever comes from within the scientific community. It always comes from people who are considered outsiders, who are considered rebels, who are considered not having the sense or the knowledge to make the breakthrough. And this was Einstein, by the way, when he was a young patent clerk. He wasn't part of the system. He just overwhelmed the system with something that was on the money.
Right.
And Darwin kind of was the same way. Outsiders, not teaching, not an accredited teacher. It always comes from people who are just doing it on their own, and they're not looking at the way things were taught to them. They're looking at the way things are. And in 1915, a weatherman named Alfred Wegener, a man who studied weather patterns, but he was also a traveler and an adventurer, and he's the one who came up with the idea that North and South America had at one time been welded to Europe and Africa in one big giant continent, because it was really clear. The evidence was clear in a number of ways. They had similar animals on both sides, the mountains, the Atlas Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains of America, and the Atlas Mountains of Europe. They looked the same. There were freshwater fish in the rivers on both sides. How could freshwater fish cross the oceans? There were monkeys, similar monkeys on both sides. There was all this evidence that Wegener pulled together, but he was an outsider, and he was saying that at a time when science and religion and everybody else was just reeling from absorbing Darwin, then he came along with something saying that the world itself was not stable, was not secure, and everybody acknowledged that volcanoes happen and that earthquakes happen and all that, but to say that the continents moved around the globe, that was just insane in 1915. And it took 50 years until 65 when it was proven in a way that it couldn't be denied anymore. And what happens is it usually requires about 50 years, because 2 full generations of scientists have to literally die, because they will not give in. They will not give in to the point, no matter how right it is. And so it takes time. If they can defeat it initially, like they couldn't defeat Darwin, they couldn't defeat Einstein, but they could defeat Wegener, and they did. And so then he was just buried and forgotten. And 50 years later, everybody realized, oh yeah, that guy was right, And that is more the pattern of science. Resistance, 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 even though it's clearly true, because they're just not ready to deal with it, and they will, because that isn't what they're taught, it's not what they believe. 2 generations die out, and the 3rd generation is comfortable enough with it to accept it. That is the pattern of scientific progress over time.
I have this great quote from Max Planck, actually said, "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die, and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it."
That's exactly what I'm saying in a very short way.
Yeah.
Exactly the truth. That's a great quote.
Yeah.
I'm amazed you could pull that one off the top of your head.
I searched for it. I remember putting it on the website, so I have it right there.
Ah, great.
But
it is. It's a perfect quote, and Max Planck was somebody that would know what he was talking about.
Yeah, exactly, definitely. And let's kind of go in the other direction, if you will. Last time you were on the program, basically you mentioned that about 120,000 years ago in the fossil record, Cro-Magnon man appears basically overnight. These guys pop up, and we connected this with the ancient Sumerian scriptures and mentioned the Anunnaki. From what we know, this was an off-world race of beings who came from Nibiru, and that these guys were responsible for genetically engineer hominoids and themselves to create the human being. According to the Sumerians, this happened around 200,000 years ago, something like that.
Right.
So, I mean, let's begin to talk a little bit about the potential reasons for this. We really didn't get into detail about this last time. I mean, do you know at this point, why did they came here? How long did they stay, and what happened to them?
Well, we can only go pretty much with the research of Zecharia Sitchin based on the writings that are left behind in the Sumerian clay tablets. Now, the Sumerians are considered the first great culture. Everyone acknowledges they appear out of nowhere. They're very highly sophisticated. They develop 100 of the firsts that we consider a part of a high society. The first writing, the first music, the first roads, the first blocked off cities, the first trade, long-term trade, first ocean-going ships. I mean, they did remarkable things, and they came out of nowhere to do this. We're not taught much about the Sumerians. The only thing we're taught really about them, and I would venture to say that most of your listeners, all you know about the Sumerians is that they invented writing, cuneiform, and that's
right.
it. That's all you're really taught.
Yeah.
You're not taught, I wasn't taught, nobody's taught that these people exploded on the earth scene with this very high culture, and that the Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks came down from them and picked up what they had from them. But the reason science doesn't deal with them is like everything else. It's an embarrassment to try to explain. If it's all about Darwinian progression, how do you go from people living in caves in the mountains, in the Zagros Mountains, to this incredible civilization flourishing down in the Tigris-Euphrates plain of modern-day Iraq? How could that have happened? In Darwinian terms, it couldn't, so they just don't talk about it. And they talk about writing because writing is so important, and they give the Sumerians credit for that, and that's pretty much it. In those writings, which are on clay tablets that have been turned into stone, they've been baked into stone, and the old, in ancient times, the catchphrase for something that was absolutely reliable was written in stone. This is written in stone.
Right.
That's why, because if the Sumerians said it, it was the way things were as far as they were concerned. And what those stone tablets say, and understand, they're interpreted different ways. The mainstream interprets them to sound like it's supporting their position, so that what they say that doesn't make sense in real world terms, they just call it myth. They just say that the Sumerians were making it up as myth. But what Sitchin says is, what would they have myth for? If they're the first culture, they're writing their history as they understand it, or their reality as they understand it. They're not creating myths. They're writing the way they understand it. And the way they say it was being told to them was that human beings, the Adamu, A-D-A-M-U, were created 200,000 years ago, that the Anunnaki, the people of the planet Nibiru that's in our solar system but comes in a very long elliptical orbit of 3,600 years, the people on that planet, the Anunnaki, came to Earth and lived here for about maybe as much as 600,000 years ago, certainly no less than 300,000 years ago, and lived for quite some time gathering gold, but gathering it easily, because all they had to do was put placers in rivers. But when they cleaned out all the easy gold, and the reason they needed gold for Nibiru, by the way, again according to them, is that they had their atmosphere and their rise to a high technology. Same thing we're doing to our atmosphere. In fact, they had damaged their atmosphere of their planet, and they needed to repair it. And they had discovered that gold ground up to the consistency of talcum powder and blown up into their upper atmosphere would act as both a reflector of dangerous cosmic rays and as an insulator. And for them, probably it was more of a need for insulation. But in any case, this is what they say. They needed gold to repair their atmosphere. They have a planet that's 3 times basically the size of Earth, so it's a big planet, and it would need a lot of gold. So they recovered what they could recover by placer mining in rivers and things where gold just would sweep along, and it would just come out in a tray, and it was very easy to recover. And then, by then, they had found the mother lode of gold on Earth, which is southern Africa, and still is to this day. And so they needed to mine it now, and they did not want to do the heavy, hard work of mining, so they needed a slave to do that work. So they decided to create one, and it was a serious thing for them to do. There was a great debate about the morality of doing this, creating a whole new sentient being that was going to have to be dealt with once they were created. And the vote was close, but the vote came down in favor of making the slave, and so they did. And the slave was the Adamu, and that was us. So they took as a model to make their slave more physically adapted to the planet than they were. They took what they called a creature of Earth, which I say obviously that means a hominoid. That would be, in my guess, the Alma type from Russia, which I believe are probably Neanderthals. Anyway, they took some of them, I would say in the range of 5 to 10% maybe, and then the rest of the new creature would be like the Anunnaki. We shall make the Adamu in our own image, after our own likeness. That very quote comes from a Sumerian tablet, and we hear several others, by the way, in Genesis, but we hear that quote coming down word for word 2,000 years later, written in Genesis. So that's apparently what they did according to the Sumerian tablets as Zecharia Sitchin has interpreted them.
You know, this is also, I mean, supported today actually in the mainstream in one way, if we do look at it, not the mythology, of course, behind this, but what we talked about before, the fact that about 200,000 years ago, I remember an article on CNN, for instance, that actually it was called Humans Nearly Wiped Out 70,000 Years Ago, study says.
Right.
And this was actually, they were talking about studies using mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through mothers, have traced modern humans to a single mitochondrial Eve who lived in Africa about 200,000 years ago. And they talked about that a small group of humans back then actually went down to the southern parts of Africa, and they don't kind of spin it in why there were a small portion of humans around at that point. But I mean, this basically you could interpret this information in two ways, and if we interpret it the way you've presented to us right now, this is actually corroborating evidence for this, and this is what the Genographic Project is doing right now. I don't know if you've heard about them at all, but they trace everything back to this mitochondrial Eve, as they call it.
Right. Well, here's something that's even more interesting. They had a book, I think, called The Seven Daughters of Eve, where all of us seem to come from 7 slightly different genetic pools that go back those 200,000 years. And I think the book is called The Seven Daughters of Eve. Get this. In the Sumerian tablets, which Sitchin wrote about, by the way, Sitchin wrote all this stuff in 1976. This is his first book, 1976, called The 12th Planet. He wrote all this. This is well before 86, 10 years later, when the mitochondrial Eve theory came out, when the mitochondrial DNA showed that the first human as we are today came into existence about 200,000 years ago. Well, that's when Sitchin was writing that we came into existence